we really need to focus on the root problems. There's a beautiful quote from Desmond Tutu saying, if you see people drowning in the river, of course it's great to help them, but also you must ask, how did they end up in the river? And so the idea is to go upstream and really focus on more core problems in the housing space. That's how we're starting to shift, is to go upstream and really focus on the marketplace, those gaps, those failures.
Welcome back to another episode of Good Work. I'm your host, Barrett Brooks, and this is a show made up of long-form interviews with talented people who are using their careers to make the world a better place. My guest today is my friend named Matthew Marshall. He's the founder of a not-for-profit organization called New Story. They were one of the first not-for-profits to go through the famed incubator called Combinator back in the day, and they are doing incredible work to bring home ownership and land ownership to families who are underhoused around the world, but especially in developing economies. Matthew is one of the kindest and most thoughtful people I know. He's the kind of person I like to sit down to dinner with for hours at a time. He can go deep on a variety of subjects, and his heart is truly in serving others in everything that he does. This episode's a little bit unique in that it was originally the pilot episode for a different podcast concept that I was considering over a year and a half ago. We recorded this episode in early 2023 and talked about some of the transformation they were going through at New Story. It has a little bit of a different structure than the typical Good Work episodes, but it was such a wonderful conversation that I didn't want to just throw it away or make Matthew re-record. I thought that you would still get great benefit out of it, so I just chose to give you the context for it instead. So please enjoy this a little bit different conversation with my friend Matthew Marshall, one of the co-founders of New Story. Let's get to it. My guest today is a man named Matthew Marshall. He is most importantly a dear friend of mine that I have known for years and consider to be like a brother to me. Of most interest to the audience will be that he's the Chief Business Officer at New Story Charity. And there are three things I want to share about Matthew. The first is that New Story must be one of the most innovative, heart-centered, mission-driven organizations that I have ever known or heard of, and certainly to have personally interacted with. I have been a proud donor, will continue to be a proud donor in the future. The second thing is that Matthew has an absolute heart of gold, and it's not fair to put anyone on a pedestal and set unreasonable expectations for them, but Matthew's the kind of person you could trust with your children, with a personal truth that you haven't shared with anyone else, and he would protect it and care for it as if it were his own. And the third thing I would like you to know is I take great pride in the fact that I hosted a men's night one time in Atlanta, way back in the day, where Matthew and the CEO and also co-founder of New Story, Brett Hagler, met. And they would go on to partner with the third co-founder named Allie, who is also a friend, and build this beautiful organization that has led us to where we are today. So that's my intro of you, Matthew. Thanks for being my guinea pig.
That's a amazing remembrance of that specific dinner, because at the time I was like, man, this gentleman Brett's kind of a nerd like me in terms of what he likes and what he is interested in. And I was like, of course, like Barrett brings very like-minded people together. And so I was like, it just all was like very clear in hindsight. It was very much a serendipitous moment in the moment, but it was like, oh, I see the through line there very clearly in retrospect.
Sure. It's funny how you can look back and see those things. And at the time, it was just like a few guys getting together for some chicken wings.
That's right.
But lest we bore the audience with personal stories to start with, let me set the table a little bit for this conversation. So I spent 5 years as the COO of a company called ConvertKit. And we were one of the earliest and kind of driving forces in the creator economy before that was a thing, before it had a name. And we built a great business on email marketing and eventually full stack marketing software for creators. I was the COO there. We built it from 3 to 30 million in revenue and 20 to 70 people and blah, 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 all the successful stuff. But what I really learned in that experience was how to build cultures, how to lead people, how to make mistakes and recover from them. In some ways, I learned how not to maintain performance long-term because I burned myself out. And 18 months ago, I left that job with an unknown destination. And I set out on this journey to find the path that I'm meant to be on at this point in my career. And that led me to a number of destinations. But ultimately, where I landed was back on my own as an entrepreneur, which is where I started my career. And I'm now a full-time writer and executive coach. I work with founders of primarily climate tech organizations and their executive teams, but also splay out into the kind of component parts of that, which is part of why I wanted to have this conversation today because of the work that y'all are doing. And my goal on this podcast is to highlight the leaders who embody some of the truths that I think I've learned about what it means to build business with a sense of purpose and where people can feel a sense of belonging while also being pushed to reach their potential. A couple of the insights that I think I know are true about business and organization building are first that organizations grow at the speed their founders grow. They can be held back by their founders, or founders can be rocket fuel for organizations. The second thing is that cultures of belonging give people the safety and sense of security they need to actually chase their potential and do it from a healthy place. And the third is that there are so many society level problems that business can solve, and certainly that nonprofits can solve in this age of work, that there should be no one that has to feel a lack of meaning in what they do every day. Certainly not amongst the privileged folks who are likely to be listening to this podcast. I think everyone should be able to find a job working on a very important problem where they can also make a good living. So my driving desire in this conversation with you, Matthew, and with all my future guests is to really start to dissect what it looks like along those categories. What does it mean to be mission driven? What does it mean to build a culture that matters? What does it mean to lead from a place of vulnerability and service? And what does it mean to maintain our own well-being so that we can perform at a high level over a long period of time? I'm going to kind of break it down in those segments of kind of starting with mission, getting into culture, moving into leadership, and then into kind of personal performance and habits. The place I want to start is I'd just love to hear you talk about kind of the heart of the work at New Story and why y'all got into this. I'm going to call it a business. It's a nonprofit, but why you got into this business of creating communities and housing for people who need them.
Really, the heart is through personal experiences. So 3 co-founders, Brett, Allie, and myself, like you mentioned, Barrett, all had different experiences growing up with our hearts really tugged on. So Brett went to Haiti in 2013. I went to Belize in early 2000s. Allie went to Ghana and Peru in the mid 2000s. So we all had these individual experiences personally meeting families who were living without safe shelter. We've all seen photos of, kids living in a tent, parents, carrying clean water to their home and having just to leave it exposed because there's no proper space. And these are real, these are not just photos you see on the news, but these are real families. And we met those families and we met local organizations also serving them. And so it was just very much a heart of there's great organizations already doing work. They're already serving these families, but they're only able to serve a handful. How might we be able to walk alongside them and help them grow and really do more than they just could on their own? Because there's enough nonprofits. There's a nonprofit for anything, flip a coin. But for us, we wanted to just amplify their work and ultimately be able to see more families move into safe housing because we had seen it directly. When families have safe housing, they sleep better, which then leads to more energy, which then can lead to better economic outcomes, which can then lead to better education outcomes, which then can be generational change, right? So it is very clear in our mind how a home literally and figuratively builds the foundation for generational change and ultimately then societal change and et cetera. But if a family is not living in a safe home, how can they focus on anything else, whether that's entrepreneurial, education, food, right? How can I start a business if my home is paper or tin or plastic, right? Someone could very easily just pop the latch or literally cut the wall. And so that's the heart of New Story, is to serve families who are most vulnerable, who are not being served by the current market, by the government, or by other NGOs in a way that's human-centered. I think that's been a very core part of our DNA from the beginning, is trying to change the script on the top-down approach that we hear so often that goes awry. A big, large NGO comes into a country, they raise billions of dollars, and then there's not much to show for it. Or a big government program starts, there's tons of subsidy that gets deployed, and then it fizzles out because the subsidy dries up or the subsidy didn't actually work. That's really what's driven us to where we're at today. We've really kind of got two acts as an organization, Act 1 and Act 2. And we're in that transition Act 2, where we realized that we could keep serving local nonprofits and other NGOs directly, but that's only going to be a drop in the bucket. We really need to focus on the root problems. There's a beautiful quote from Desmond Tutu saying, if you see people drowning in the river, of course it's great to help them, but also you must ask, how did they end up in the river? And so the idea is to go upstream and really focus on more core problems in the housing space, which I'm sure we'll get into. But that's how we're starting to shift, is to go upstream and really focus on the marketplace, those gaps, those failures.
I love hearing you and the rest of your team talk about housing as a kind of nexus of issues, or maybe a foundation for solving a nexus of issues is really the right way to talk about it. And, you can come at this from so many different angles. Like if I think about it from climate angle, I think about it from the standpoint of resiliency, the number of people who will continue to lose homes and as the climate continues to change, and how the need for the work that you all are doing will continue to grow probably exponentially with time, unless we really solve things, right? But there's both ends of it. We've got to be resilient and we need to solve the core problem at the climate level. And then there's the micro level. People without a home cannot contribute to solutions to problems because they have base level needs on the hierarchy of human needs, exactly. Which is the point that you were getting at. So, I want to go back to the beginning. I'd love to just hear a story or two about how the three of you at the outset decided on what mission to pursue. Let's just start there. How did you decide, is there a story or a time when y'all chatted through all the different things you could do together, and how did you land on this mission?
Yeah. Honestly, we didn't have that deep of a discussion around what general areas we could focus on. It was pretty clear that housing was the thing from the first couple of days. And I think that comes from a lot of our, again, experiences seeing individuals in these situations, and specifically knowing one local partner in Haiti that we could easily work with and that was doing great work. So it was very much it felt like the path had been carved a little bit for us in a way. And so really, when we were first getting started, it was not this big grand vision of let's go change the world, let's try to build, 1 million homes. It was, there are families in Haiti still living in tarp tents from the 2010 earthquake. And there's a local nonprofit building them safe, adequate homes for $6,000 US dollars. Let's try to bring them more funding so that they can build more homes. That was literally the problem we were trying to solve. And so we started doing things that you've probably heard about other charities doing, right? Birthday campaigns, small events with high net worth individuals, beating on any door and every door that we could get into. And so it was really just kind of like a one by one. We, at the very beginning of the organization, we put every single family on our website. So you get to meet them, understand their story, and then ultimately when they moved in, we would send a video to every donor. I wish we could still do that because it was a beautiful closing the loop. And now that we've gotten to a little bit larger, it's hard to do. But that was the core problem that we were focused on.
Yeah. So every time I've ever been an entrepreneur, which is a couple times in my life, it's always been just me. I've never had a co-founder. So one of the things I've always wondered about is, what's that conversation look like? Was there a moment when you're like, is it like, will you marry me? Or is it more of just this gradual kind of, we're working on a concrete problem and, oh, hey, I guess maybe we'll start an organization. How did that work for y'all?
There was honestly more of a implied understanding that we're all loving this and feeling aligned in our values and who we are and our like similar interest. I don't ever remember us having like a formal, like, let's sit down and like, do you want to be a co-founder or not? That was, maybe I'm misremembering, but I don't remember there ever being a formal conversation like that. It was a like, hey, this evening we're all going to meet at Matthew's apartment in Grant Park and have a conversation about this, and that. And then we're like, cool, I'll work on that this week. You work on that this week. And then the next week we would come back and do it again. And that was like 6 months. And Allie was like, hey, we should apply to Y Combinator. Like, what's the worst that's going to happen? Like, they tell us no. They tell that to 99.99% of everyone else. So like, let's just throw our hat in the ring. And I'm glad she said that, because that really kind of was the catalyst for New Story going from being in Matthew's apartment to something much larger. But no, it was never a formality to it. It was more of a, let's take one step, let's take another step, and just one step led to another.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. One of the things that I've learned as I've written publicly a lot over the years and talked more about a sense of purpose and connection to the work is, for some people, it's really triggering. It's like, work isn't about purpose. Work is just how I provide for my family. I know that's true for a lot of people. And like, I'm not saying that it's correct to feel a sense of purpose at work. I have done both. I have had ways of earning a living that just felt like that. And I have had ways that I felt deeply connected to my work. And I know that for me, if I can overlap a feeling of deep connection to the ultimate purpose and mission of what I'm doing, and I can earn a living, that is the sweet spot for me. That feels like where I feel most aligned to myself. But mission is not universal. In a way, it's like inherent to the definition of the word. Any given person, any given organization has a mission. I think especially deeply inquiring minds, want a sense of meaning and purpose in what they do. And so it's not universal. It's not universally true that everyone needs to pursue any one thing. And I'm fascinated by what makes a given person connected to a given mission. You shared the story of each of you having had experiences related to housing. You went to Belize. What about that experience did you connect to emotionally? Like, what impact did it have on you and your kind of soul level?
I have a hard time separating out purpose and work from my spiritual beliefs and my faith. And those things in my mind are very tied. I can't just separate them. They're very much one and the same cloth. And so for me, growing up in the church, I very much wanted to be able to help others and love others. And seeing my parents do that, through our local community organizations, me doing some of that through Boy Scouts, there was always that like kind of core component of service. Specifically when we went to Belize, I think seeing and walking into families' homes that were vastly different, like just 180, completely different from what I had experienced growing up, was shocking. It was like very viscerally shocking to feel the heat, the smell, the humidity, and then, to be honest, like go to the bathroom. Like, as simple as that is, like when you use a latrine in a very remote part of, the countryside, it's a very different like feeling emotionally than what we're expecting or traditional feeling here in the US. So I think honestly, it was just kind of that, wow, this is a reality for a lot of families. And at that time I couldn't articulate it. I think I was 15 or 14 or something like that. Couldn't articulate it, but it stuck with me. And I don't know if it was necessarily housing ingrained from that point, but it was a just general contextual awareness now of the situations. So if you ask me, like, New Story, could have been something like clean water or maybe clean energy for low-income families. Like, there's not that big of a difference from that experiential. Obviously, there's a massive difference in mission of the organization, but I don't, for example, if we would have pivoted 6 months into a New Story to be like a clean water organization, I would have been like, yes, that is a huge need. And there's so many families that could benefit from this. I think I'm very thankful that housing has been the thing, because as we learn more and as we got into this space, it's just become more clear to me how fundamental housing, it touches everything, right? It touches water, it touches energy, it touches entrepreneurship, it touches education, economic outcomes. I'm very thankful that that's been the thing, but I also wouldn't say that it's been a through line necessarily from that. It was kind of like starting broad and then narrowing in versus narrow all the way.
Right. Yeah, that resonates with me too. I mean, one of the things I love about the world of climate solutions is that it's kind of like reinventing everything to be more sustainable, more resilient, more good for human health, good for planetary health. You know, it's like, pick a thing, let's reinvent it. And housing has that same kind of element to it. There's so much in a home, so much that certainly for me and my life and my background, I take for granted. It's like, yeah, I started life in a very small home. It's like a little tiny 2-bedroom, 700 square foot place or whatever. But by comparison to what we're talking about, what a luxury, And then as we grew older and entered the middle class and all of that, it was like, wow, I mean, absolute luxury by comparison. How easy that is to miss, as you're going through life. But I also love the point that, I'm a dad, so I have 2 kids now, and I think a lot about exposure. Exposure is a topic that I really care deeply about when it comes to parenting, because what we don't realize along the way are these seeds that are being planted in us. And I think that they become attached to emotional experience. You had an emotional experience of seeing something so different. And ultimately, it was an empathetic experience of imagining what must it be like for this to be not what you fly into and out of, like I get to do, but where you live, where you go to the bathroom every day, where you're at risk every day. And that stayed with you long enough so that 10 years later, you could say, I know what problem I want to work on. And I think about that for myself. I grew up similarly. I'm Christian, you're Christian. I didn't go to church for a long time, but we always did service work. I grew up Habitat for Humanity. Our church organized these great days of service every year. We would go out in the community and repair and rebuild homes for people. And, I just had so many of those experiences growing up. At the time, it's like, well, this is what a good person does. But what I didn't realize was these deep, deep seeds it was planting in, like my heart and soul of there's so much good that can be done, both at a small scale and like the individual acts all the way up to, massive gestures and organizations like yours. So I'm just interested in how you can shape that, how we can continue to encourage future generations to be of service to others and think about their careers through this lens, but also just examining our own past and thinking about how we were shaped in that way that leads us to, work, ultimately being called towards work that is deeply meaningful and has something bigger involved than just getting paid.
The part of having a purpose in work and having a mission in work, I think it's very obvious, like the external benefits of doing that, right? I'm working on housing or climate or whatever it may be. But I think it's also worth talking about and remembering the internal work that happens when you're your own mission, so to speak, or your own purpose. Because at least one of the beliefs I have is we are shaped continually by our experiences. And ultimately, I believe we're being refined into really who we were meant to be, either direction, who we were meant to be, or kind of downward away from who we were meant to be. And I think each experience we have, both in our family, friendships, but then we spend so much time at work, right? I don't remember what percentage of our time is at work for our working life, but so maybe the largest chunk.
Yeah. And maybe sleep is the only thing we do more of.
Yeah. And so I just think about that too. It's not just the external, it's the internal soul, it's the internal well-being and the sanctification or the like development of our character and the ability to grow. Because let's be honest, like doing work that has purpose or mission towards greater good is inherently more difficult. I think most people may assume that it's like easier to be at a nonprofit or it's easier to work on some of these problems, but I think that honestly are more difficult usually. Like there's more headwinds usually. So I try to remember that too.
Yeah. Yeah. And no, I mean, in some ways, there's a huge selfish element to it. It's like, how do you feel when you're doing that kind of work? But there's also this process of, I think of it in like coaching terms as integration. And a lot of times, or a hypothesis I have is that a lot of times mission and a feeling of calling towards something is rooted in pain, either our own or witnessing the pain of others and wanting to relieve that pain. We're naturally driven to try and relieve our own pain and the pain of people we care about. And a huge part of the journey of doing work on that, if we allow it to mold us, is integrating that pain into something more wholesome, something more that we're more aware of, that we're more conscious of, and that we're actively working to heal in ourselves and in the people that we're working alongside. At its worst, I think sometimes this work can actually make the pain worse, because it feels like if you feel like you're not solving it, I think it can eat at you in a way that can become really unhealthy. That's kind of the dark side of this type of thing, is it's like, I can never do enough. I'm curious if you ever have that experience doing this work of feeling like we just are never going to be able to solve this thing, or moments of kind of despair along the way.
I have tried to grow in my understanding that like what we are doing here today is helpful, and we can't do everything. We can't control the situations. We can't control honestly, if we're being honest, much of anything. We can control very little. And so trying to gain peace around, okay, what are the inputs we can put in? And then how can we just be content or at peace with some of the outcomes, knowing that we can't control those. And if we do, we're going to get very stressed out. And ultimately, if we're thinking about sustainability and doing this work for the long term, the like tighter we hold on, the harder it is for us to do that over time. Almost the analogy of like your muscles becoming fatigued, like the tighter you hold. And maybe you can do that for a little bit of time. But what is that? And maybe a little bit is a couple of years. Like we're very resilient as humans, but like immediately then your hands are like atrophied because you haven't been flexing them and squeezing them, Yeah. That's maybe a poor analogy, but somewhat helpful, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. This idea of holding on so tight to trying to solve everything that you're actually not able to sustain the good work that you are doing. There's this tension between that I see at play. And maybe this gets a little bit into the culture of News Story and what makes you unique as an organization. And one thing I'll just pause and call out, there's probably 100 places people can go to learn the timeline of News Story. Y'all have done podcast interviews, been featured in Fast Company. Your website does a good job of documenting your journey. I'm honestly not here to do that. So if someone's like, when are we going to get we're getting the story of the leadership and culture and mission of News Story, and not the events and the facts and, So for what that's worth for listeners, if you're like, I don't know what's going on, I'd encourage you to read more about News Story, listen to other podcasts where the story has been told. And the point here is really to get into the leadership and mindset and how it's been built, how, not just what. So after that quick pause for station identification, I'm interested in these 2 points of tension that I think have really shaped who y'all are. And one is, on one hand, being very ambitious in the impact you do want to make. And on the other hand, being very understanding and kind to yourselves about what is your work to do, what you can do as an organization. And that's a tension every organization has to cope with. And I think there are very many unhealthy ways to do it. So I want to get into some of that. I'm also highly aware of the tension between impact and the reality of the financials of an organization. Your impact is always limited by your financial reality. It just is. It's a thing that I think many people wish weren't true. I wish it wasn't true. And yet we have to confront it. And I actually want to start there because I think that's also shaped your culture as an organization, is battling this desire for impact with the reality of the financial need. How have you tackled, you're a nonprofit, just in case anyone isn't aware. And so you have a fundraising model, but you've also explored other possibilities for how you can continue to fund the organization. How has that evolved over time, and how specifically have you dealt with the tension between the need for funding and the impact you want to have?
It's very much attention. So just a very short story. News Story has historically been, I would say, like 75% high net worth individual funded, and the other 25% coming in a mixture of corporations, individuals, and some foundations, which is somewhat different from other organizations or other nonprofits, which are primarily foundation funded or institutional funded. News Story has kind of done the opposite, which we can talk about if we want to. But I would say it's been just a very clear, there is, I think we did the math, it was like $16 trillion worth of housing need globally or something. And maybe even more than that, but it's huge. It's massive. It's even hard to imagine like how much money, housing being one of obviously the most capital intense things anyone does, whether you're a family in the United States or your family in Jalisco, Mexico. It's one of the most expensive assets and purchases you'll ever make. And so given that, over the course of News Story, we were confronted with that reality and constantly trying to think and iterate on like, okay, philanthropy can't be the answer. Like philanthropy can be really helpful in R&D and testing certain models and covering the overhead of the team, salaries, travel, admin, office, etc. But there's not enough philanthropy unless you're one of, top 1% individual, then maybe. But for us as an organization, we started to get into impact investment and blended finance, really starting to use a different type of funding, but still always having philanthropy there. And I wish that was one of our kind of initial learnings. I wish we could somehow go back in time and say like, okay, from the beginning, let's focus on models and focus on partners who can execute with blended finance, meaning both concessionary debt financing and philanthropy, because I do think that is a model that can really scale. And I think just getting into a little bit of a strategy is like thinking about who is the payer at scale and who is the doer at scale. Because at the beginning, News Story didn't have that clarity. We weren't even able to articulate those terminology. But I think if anyone's, at the early stage of an organization that's focused on good, is like, what does it look like at 1 million individuals? Who's actually paying for that? Who's paying for the homes? Who's paying for the financing? And who's doing it? Is your organization doing it? Or are there international banks that are doing it? Or are there local credit unions that are doing it? Being very clear with that, I think, is helpful. Because News Story, now we believe the customer is going to be the payer at scale. And we believe that the local market is going to be the doer at scale. So it's not News Story. It's not a local NGO being the doer. It's not the government being the payer. It's not a international bank being the payer. But we believe the customer will be the payer and the local market will be the doer.
And so in that model where, to put it in kind of concrete terms, it would be similar to you paying your mortgage or rent. The person living in the house pays something to live there. And we can get more into that if we want to. And then there are businesses, builders on the ground who are responsible for building homes and communities. So what is the role of News Story and kind of how have you shaped your internal narrative to fit that reality?
We see ourselves as we've been struggling to like come up with one term because there's like a couple things, but like facilitator, catalyst, accelerator, those like terms is what we are in the market. So for example, let's say, Barrett, you're a home builder in Mexico and I'm an individual family who wants to, purchase a home. And there's a hypothetical third person on this call that's the local credit union. Well, I want to purchase your home, but I don't have the financing. So I need to go to the credit union, right? To get a micro mortgage or maybe even a home improvement loan because I want to expand my home. Okay, cool. Well, I get the financing. Then I go to you and you do the work, right? So like, it's just like we do in the United States, but it's focused on really affordable products. So unlike the culture in the United States where we may move to expand our home, right? Or to like move into a bigger house, in Latin America, the norm is to add on. So either go vertical or go horizontal, which means that, to add on a room is actually way more affordable than go, purchase a new home. So a lot of our work in the future will be focused on home improvements, and specifically, how do you help families do quality home improvements that are actually safe and durable? So all that to be said, we see ourselves playing a role of taking risk early in a model and saying, hey, developer, you may not actually have the risk tolerance to do this model yet. So we're going to provide a guarantee, or we'll provide the financing such that you take this risk, and we show you that the model actually can work. So, in that hypothetical scenario I gave, it could be the developer or it could be the financial institution that's like, we want to do this, but like the risk profile is just too much. So New Story says, okay, great. We're willing to take that risk because we believe there's an opportunity here based on data and research. And we're going to bring in some of our team's expertise to help along the way. So really combining that catalytic capital and that we call it technical expertise, but it's basically just our team coming in to work together. Those are the ways we facilitate the market, so to say.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. So zooming out a little bit and thinking about the way that your internal culture is formed, I want to reflect to you what I see from the outside and what I think are the cultural drivers. And I want to see how that holds up to how you see it from the inside. And then I also want to talk a little bit about unique cultural practices, like practical cultural practices that you all may have built that others might apply. So from the outside looking in, the defining elements of New Story from my seat are first, the human connection that you all want to build both between colleagues and also between your team and your customers. That at the root of all of this is human relationship. The second thing I see is that you all have an ethos and commitment to true innovation, not like the tired and worn out version of that, but reinventing yourself, breaking your own model, completely starting over when you learn something that shows you how you could better achieve the mission. The third is a commitment to building research-backed, data-driven expertise, really committing to understanding what works and then applying that back into the process of innovation and to building better homes and communities for people. And then lastly, I think you have a commitment to impact through accountability of yourselves that is uncommon. From an early stage, y'all were measuring, does this work? Does it actually produce outcomes that we say that it does? And if it doesn't, what are we getting wrong? Let's go back and build that back into our expert model of expertise so that we can apply it in how we're doing work. So those are some of the core elements to me. It's like the human connection, the commitment to innovation, the expertise and kind of building out a team that really knows what they're doing through learning and research, and then the commitment to measuring your impact and holding yourselves accountable. I'm interested to know how that holds up to how you all see yourselves internally.
I think that's a great summary. And maybe if I were to add one, and I'm sure we could start to list out more, but there is a hunger to bring in expert or like external knowledge. So you mentioned the research, and that's like getting into the detail of like, how many families live in this geography and how many are demand and what's the nuance of that. But I think also there's a lot related to just the pure, hey, let's bring in an expert that like we have no business speaking to, and let's really try to understand what they're doing and learning. And so I would say kind of the intersection of high performance, human connection, fun, and learning. Like if I were to put like 4 like kind of pillars, I think those are great ones. But yeah, you got it pretty spot on.
Do you remember the first time that you all realized that what you were doing wasn't the optimal way to go about achieving the mission?
The first time, yeah, it was.
Or maybe even a time that just stands out.
Yeah, you mentioned like reinventing ourselves. I think we probably reinvented ourselves like 4 times in 8 years of different sizes and different complexities.
I'd love to hear the story of the first time that you did. And I'd love to also hear the story of the latest reinvention.
So the first one is going from kind of that one-to-one model that I was speaking on earlier, right? We identify a local nonprofit, we work with them, we serve families one-on-one. We realized, I think this was kind of core summer 2017-ish, we realized that is working. However, they need tools and they need other types of products that they could use to like scale their work as well. And I'm not talking just like software. I'm talking about like playbooks and other models of operating as well. And we started to build some of those internally. Like we built a playbook for how to design human-centered communities and very much handing that to organizations. We also built a software product to help with repayment collection. We built a software product related to data collection that could work offline without internet, which turns out at that time was like not a common thing and is an absolute technological beast to try to figure out. And the reason why we decided that we needed to do some of those things is because we said, okay, well, News Story can keep working with these organizations, but if we have to keep working kind of like hand holding, we can't scale our work. So let's like set them up with the tools they need, the picks, the hammer, so to speak, of what they need so they can grow. There's some like fundamental things we got wrong in that as well, which we can talk about. But that was one of the first times, and like why we were trying to do that was very much as saying, okay, let's focus on what can be repeatable and scalable, because our just work one-on-one is it's not going to do it.
So, again, in hindsight, it's so easy to look back and see these transformations, and in the moment, I imagine these times as being full of tension and questioning and maybe even conflict at times over what are we really doing here? Doing the math on how many homes are we going to be able to build in 50 years if we keep on this model, and how do we solve for that? What was that experience like internally? How was the emotional side of it for you and the team as you were exploring how to transform yourselves?
At that time, I'm not sure if we, and when I say we, the co-founders, had the skill set as leaders to be as attuned as we should have been to the transformation that was happening in the organization and to ourselves or within ourselves. So honestly, I think we missed an opportunity there to be more thoughtful and more sophisticated. Again, hindsight's 2020, we were 27 years old. So we were still learning just general professional things, right? Like how to be the best professionals we could be. But I think there was a lot of things we missed there. But in general, that internal time was quite dynamic because we were very small. So we were able to be pretty nimble in our operations. I remember at that time we were probably 12 people, something like that. Maybe not.
So you could still get everyone around a table.
Yeah, it was quite, I would say, straightforward, not easy, but straightforward to like communicate, right? Here's what we want to do. Here's where we feel like we're going to go. And let's have conversations if no one's on the same page or confused. Nowadays,
Did you have to do that?
I remember probably some individual conversations, but at the time, it was pretty clear to the team and to us that like we need to do something differently. I think if we like, again, had more experience of where we're at today, we would have seen a lot more of those problems that was inherently built in. But no, at that time it was quite straightforward in the terms of the like team buy-in and cohesion.
And then so take us fast forward to the latest kind of transformation or reinvention, and what drove that, and how was that different than the first time that you did it?
I would say the last time, so really obviously COVID threw a huge wrench in our operations, completely paused everything that we were doing. And in hindsight, that was really great for us because it really helped us reset in many ways and understand, hey, there's a bigger picture here. I would say the main differences have been a philosophy and a mindset shift related to how international development can happen through the local market. We had started to understand that, okay, nonprofits, and again, through experience, through trying to work with these local nonprofits, that is great, but there are restrictions, there are limits to that work, and there are a limit to the number of those organizations available. And so just to like share a little bit, some of our other iteration was around governments, like working directly through governments. You could probably assume some of the challenges we experienced in trying to work with governments, but ultimately we realized like the local marketplace is the thing that is going to really drive the needle if there is scale. The power of a family being able to choose a product that's affordable to them will beat almost any other option, because the family can talk about, is this a desirable product for me? Does this meet my needs? I think a lot of some of our traditional work in the subsidy-based world was not as focused on that desirability as we should have been. We were still building human-centered places, but we weren't as deliberate about, okay, is this a market product? Could this operate, and be repeatable? So a lot of it is just mindset and philosophy shift. And I have to credit a lot of that coming from our new executive team member, Sandra Pietro, and really bringing in a new, fresh perspective. Now that shift into the organization now has been a lot more challenging because it is a larger team and because it is like a truly more fundamental shift in the approach. It's still working through partners, so that's consistent. But the way we work through partners, or the how we work through partners, is very different. It's really dropping a lot of that subsidy mindset and picking up a mindset of, okay, how does the developer win in this case? How does the family win in this case? How does the local government win? Et cetera, et cetera. It needs to be a win, 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 win for everyone involved. There could be a lot of stakeholders in some of these projects. So yes, it's been much more challenging because it's been more fun. It's been more of a fundamental philosophy change than just a strategy change.
Yeah. And it brings a lot more complexity. Every additional connection in the stakeholder model increases the complexity of relationships that are present, and the touch points between them. I mean, we could spend a whole hour talking about the strategy of all of that, but I think to bring it back to what we were talking about, it's this willingness to reinvent in the face of new information in pursuit of the mission. It's like we see a better way to achieve the mission at bigger scale and therefore more impact and the same level of outcomes if we change ourselves. And, you go back to this kind of like driving idea of, you look at Haiti back when we were graduating college, that was when that happened. It was right when we were coming out of school. Just throw a little Go Dogs in there because we can right now.
That's it.
And there were so many organizations raising money and not wasting it on purpose, but in hindsight, wasting it, just kind of flushing money. And so much of what y'all were trying to do is not be that, not repeat those mistakes that sometimes big, somewhat more bureaucratic nonprofits can get into these traps of. And you just continue to remain committed to that in a very pure kind of way that I'm sure is not easy. It's actually probably creates a lot of tumult, and it's much harder as a leader to lead through that, but it keeps you committed it keeps the arrow pointed on true north.
I'll just add one quick thing there. I think there's a lot of mindset that needs to change around charity work that we thought we were changing at the beginning of the organization. And I think we were changing a lot of it around accountability and transparency, but that was more on the like donor side. I think on the like field level, or if you want to call it operational level, that's where we had changed some, right? Like being more human-centered, less top-down. But there was still this shift in approach. And for anyone that wants to study it, it's market systems development is the like fundamental thesis of change. So like, how do you change the marketplace and develop the marketplace? And that, like you said, Barrett, is a more sophisticated and complex approach. But going back to the quote I mentioned earlier, if we're thinking about how to stop people from getting in the river and drowning, how can we go upstream and focus on more of those root things? I think
build a bridge or whatever.
Yeah. I think that is true whether you're in for-profit or nonprofit. Are the problems we're working on the surface level things, or are they the fundamental, issues? I was talking to a good friend recently, and we're talking about some of the dynamics here in the US. And I was kind of getting to the point where I'm feeling like a lot of it's tied to being unrooted in a place, unrooted in a community, or uprooted, you can maybe even say, from our place, time, culture, things like that, which I'm sure we could have a long podcast on too. But like, are we getting to the root things? When we're talking about mental health and whether to ban TikTok, stuff like that, I think we're talking about the surface level issues, not the root. And so I think just a different mindset, I think, is needed.
Yeah, I agree. I want to talk a little bit about rootedness as we talk about maintaining our own performance and kind of what keeps us fueled as individuals here in a little while. I want to wrap up talking about culture. We've talked about it almost in the embodiment of culture and the way that you operate. So much of culture happens on the interpersonal level. We talk about culture, like the cliche stuff is actually almost like stupid. I can't even believe we ever talked about culture as just the spaces we exist in, or the drinks in the fridge, or whatever the like trite, dumb kind of thing we were doing was. But really, to me, culture is quality and foundational aspects of the interpersonal relationships within an organization, and space can facilitate that, leadership can facilitate that, value systems can. There's any number of things that augment it and help encourage it, but ultimately it's how do you relate to your co-founder? How does a person on the team relate to you? How do two people on the team relate to each other? And then in different group dynamics, how does everyone come together, make decisions, go in the same direction, root for each other, resolve conflict? There's so many elements of culture. One of the things that I think I've grown to believe over time is that every organization that builds great culture because they believe in it does it through a series of cultural practices. They have shared habits that they maintain as an organization over time, and they're often quite unique, but they often, I also think, solve for these fundamental needs that we have for connection and vulnerability and things like that. So I'd love to just hear, like, what are some of the cultural practices and habits that y'all have created and maintained over time?
Some of the kind of core ones that have been true over time have been a weekly Friday values call. So where we shout everyone out. Well, each person can shout out one person basically and say, hey, I want to shout out Janae for humble pursuit of excellence, and then a short story of how that demonstrated. And I think that is a great way to say, hey, our values are more than just words on the about page. We're actually looking for how people are displaying that. And it's everyone. It's not the leadership doing that. It's everyone. And I think that is something that starts to become more difficult the larger you get and the more remote you get, because I don't have as much visibility as what you're doing. I can see you on the screen and have some good connection, but I don't see all the things. So, we've, and I'll mention this, like remote has been a challenge for us, going from in-person organization to a hybrid organization has been difficult. And so we have those value shout outs. We also have something called a hang 10, which is basically like let's spend 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Sometimes they turn into longer conversations, but it's just a one-on-one. We generally have a rule that we don't discuss work during it. And sometimes work comes up and that's important. But typically we try to keep it like, hey, what's like something you're excited about? What's a book you're reading? What's a podcast? Blah, blah, blah. Really just trying to connect on that one-to-one level. And again, that's been challenging in remote work as well. But I think this does help facilitate, like you said, the importance of that connection and the importance of those relationships. Because ultimately, if I can like trust you, I can then bring you a difficult situation and say, hey, Barrett, we need to talk about this, and that. The other one is in-person, like summits is what we call them. We've historically tried to do them every 6 months. Typically now we're doing them about a year. We'd like to get back to every 6 months when we can. But I think that's really important for our remote organizations to get that in-person time and really just connect and spend time. In those times, we've had some really fun cultural norms that have changed over time. Like, for example, the first, I would say 6 years of the organization, we would do a chop challenge, which is literally dividing into teams of like 4 or 5, and you're cooking a meal, and then we're all like up against each other, right? Like similar like to the Food Network shows. And so stuff like that, like having fun. Nowadays it looks different, playing games when we're all together, those kind of things. The other thing that I think we've done on and off that's been really helpful is bringing in external speakers at different levels of the organizations, whether it's the director level or the team level, and bringing in a fresh, just like perspective on a problem or a topic. And then during COVID, we did a lot of facilitated conversations with an external therapist and group, just like really creating space for us all to talk together and with one another. And we've still maintained some of that in different modes and methods. And then I would say the other one is, and we could probably keep going, but in like an intense onboarding process, we have, I would say, an unusual onboarding process where a lot of our team members would be like, this is the best onboarding I've ever had. And so we really over communicate around what's the organization like, what's our cultural norms? Why do we not have meetings on Tuesdays? Like, what's up with that? What is the best way to give and share feedback? Like it's like really in depth, and we don't necessarily try to assume you know anything. We tell you the history of the organization from day one to now. I'd say that onboarding process is really helpful for team members. And as you get bigger and you get remote, right? I don't have that historical context, and I'm also not in the office with people who have that historical context of like, this is the thing we do, or this is who we are.
One thing I want to highlight about that, I want to highlight a couple things, and I want to dig in on the onboarding thing a little bit, but nothing damages a sense of belonging more than feeling like everyone else understands something you don't. Nothing, I don't think, damages it more. Maybe active like ostracization or something like that. But coming into an organization and feeling like everyone understands elements of the work environment that you don't, immediately you're the outcast.
Yeah.
By no intention, right?
Yeah.
In some ways, it's actually through a lack of intention. And so I want to come back to onboarding for that point here in just a minute. But I want to go back and highlight some of the needs, the fundamental needs and just like pillars of great cultures, from my opinion, that I think you're hitting on. So the value shout outs, praise. We focus so much on criticism and growth feedback, and it's so important. There's a huge need for, radical candor is my favorite framework for this. But on the flip side of that, I don't care who you are, and I will argue till I'm blue in the face on this with people on Twitter. Sometimes even I'll do it. People need praise. And if you're telling yourself you don't need praise, that's coming from a place of pain. I almost guarantee you. And part of that is I know that that's where it comes from for me. Forever I said I don't need recognition. I do it for the good of the good. And finally, I admitted to myself, that is damaging. If I never express the fact that I need to know that the people around me appreciate me, I actually just become more and more bitter and resentful over time. Now, that's not the same experience for everyone, but everyone has an element of that. We want to know we're appreciated. Organizational culture research is notoriously difficult to replicate. So I want to be careful about quoting things on this show. But one that I have seen that through experience I believe to be directionally true is that the ratio of praise to criticism that develops healthy relationships is definitely north of 1-to-1. One piece I saw said it was more like 5-to-1, 4 or 5-to-1, meaning 4 pieces of praise for every piece of criticism. I just want everyone listening to sit and think about that for a minute. In your organization, how many people are getting 1 piece of praise for every piece of criticism they get? How many of your kids are getting 1 piece of praise for every piece of criticism they're getting? I know on some days my kids aren't. As humans, we need reassurance and praise. So anyways, that's the one.
Let me just add something there, Bert. It's got to be authentic, right? You can't just make up stuff, right? People are expert BS readers, smellers.
Yeah.
So it's got to be genuine and authentic, and also
specific.
Yeah, specific and rooted in something. Like I'm not just shouting you out like kind of random. I mean, I guess that's fine, but like the reason why we tie it to our values is because like this is what we want to see and this is who we are.
Yeah.
We've got, I guess, broad enough values to where we can like kind of tie almost any praise to them in some way or another. But I think that just reinforces the value system.
Yeah.
It's like This is a real thing. It's not just like for new team members, right? They're like, oh, team of founders looks like that too. Team of founders also looks like this. Team of founders looks like this too. No, I think when you have some of this kind of type of culture, and I think something we're going to do soon is like clarifying what it also is not. What is your value not? I think that's also as important as defining what it is.
I always loved since I heard it, I have loved the litmus test on organizational values of, could another organization have the opposite value? Because if there is no counterpoint to what you value, then is it meaningful? And that's been a helpful filter for me of thinking, is this differentiated from anything in the world? And therefore, does it help me act differently? It's like integrity. It's like, well, what would the opposite of that be? Lying? Would any reasonable organization have a value of lying? No, of course they wouldn't. So why are we stating that,
I think if you were to go into a little more nuance of integrity, I think that would actually be very valuable, because I think there is a lot of gray area integrity that people skirt and or deliberately go into. And so some of the like vagueness, I think, so we have a culture code book. It's probably 50 pages long or something like that. Gets into our values and why they're there and what they mean and examples. But I think some of it is in the definition. Like certain people think this is integrity and other people think that's integrity. So really defining it for your organization, I think is quite critical.
And getting down to that layer where it can be differentiated, you talking about the values and how y'all share them internally. I recently set a daily reminder for myself that hits my phone every day at 7 a.m. And it's rooted in Atlanta hip hop culture. It's don't talk about it, be about it. And the celebration of the values in that way and connecting it back is that, it's like the talking about it versus being about it. Okay, the second thing was the hang tens. And I just loved the little moments of personal connection, little chance to build an understanding of someone else's reality for even 10 or 15 minutes.
I'm going to comment on that one really quickly too. So we had a tough week last week, and just like creating space to like open the floor up for individuals to share. And obviously that comes by establishing trust and establishing an invitation, right? Especially important to know the power dynamic at play between leaders and direct team members, direct contributors, and in inviting them into that. I think there's one thing of being like, no one's being transparent with me. It's like, did you ask them to be transparent with you? So those hang tens manifest also in a leadership moment too, where we just kind of clear the floor and be like, hey, I know last week was a really difficult week. I just want to hear your honest thoughts. Like, you can be transparent with me. I may not be able to answer all the questions. I may not be able to give you as much clarity as you want or feel like you need, but I do want to try to answer as much as I can.
Yeah. I want to come back to the transparency thing as we transition into talking about leadership and your leadership journey here in just a second. But a big part of that is also not just did you ask them to be, but did you make it safe for them to be transparent? So the third thing you talked about is summits, and we did retreats back in my ConvertKit days as well. And there's so many elements that are just so foundational to getting people together in that environment. Two big ones are, first of all, shared experiences. So much of relationships are built on memories of shared experiences. It almost doesn't matter what you do. It just matters that you do something unique. The chopped thing, going out on dune buggies, surfing. I'm doing beach examples because we used to mostly go to warm places in the winter, but it can literally be anything. Yoga, escape rooms, just cooking meals together. Like, it does not matter. It's merely being with a group of people in shared experience. The two other elements, though, are sharing meals transforms relationships. And third, there is something about seeing people right before they go to bed and right after they wake up that humanizes them in a way almost nothing else does. Because it's one of those things where you realize, oh, everyone puts on pajamas and takes their makeup off and, looks disheveled when they wake up because they're human. And I think so much of work is centered around these masks and uniforms that we put on It's like, we suit up every day, even though we don't really dress up for work anymore, in our world at least.
Yeah.
And it breaks that down in a way that almost nothing else can.
I give you one fun example from was this from our last? It may have been from 2 summits ago. Actually, I'll give you 2 fun examples just really quickly to bring the humanity, like you're saying, our very humanness. Brett used to, I put this in quotes, rap in middle school because he would actually freestyle from things he had memorized. And so he was trying to build good friendships, right? So he went off and memorized and then he would come back. But anyways, that desire to be a rapper manifested at one of our summits where we sang a Biggie song and transformed the lyrics into news story, applicable things. And he opened it. I added a couple stanzas, and then Allie, closed us in a couple stanzas. We looked like complete fools, we were completely ridiculous. But, honestly, the lyrics are quite good because one of our team members here is a great copywriter, stuff like that. And then the one prior to that was, we did a funny, really just kind of someone put a plate of mystery food in front of us and we had to eat it without seeing it. And we had to describe it to the other co-founders and say okay, this is sticky. It's kind of maybe sweet. And they had to figure out what it was. And Brett had protein powder because that was his food everywhere. So stuff like that, just being, goofy, I think is really important too. We take ourselves seriously and not at the same exact time, because the work can be overwhelming, too difficult at times if you're just serious. We're just going to be buttoned up all the time, no fun. I don't think that's the best environment.
Hey, it's Barrett. You've reached about the midpoint of this conversation, and while we take a little break for station identification, as they say, I want to tell you about 2 things. First of all, I write a newsletter every Saturday for founders and creators who are leading teams and companies to make an impact through your work. It has 3 sections in it. The first one is a mini essay from me based on my executive coaching work with founders and creators about how to lead well. It has 3 long-form essays or links from around the web that will help spark new thoughts to help you lead better. And it has 1 quote from a meaningful book that I often find myself recommending to friends and clients. All the feedback I've gotten so far is that it hits exactly on the kinds of issues that founders, CEOs, and creators are facing every day in their work. So if that sounds appealing to you, make sure to go to my website at barrettbrooks.com and you can subscribe right at the top of the homepage. That's BARRETTBROOKS.com. The second thing I want to tell you about is that my day job, I actually do have a day job, I'm not just a podcaster yet, is as an executive coach, as I just mentioned. I work with founders of Series A startups and later, and with creators who are doing at least $1 million as a solo founder and are now thinking about growing a team. The uniting commonality between the founders and the creators I work with is that you've reached a point in your business where you're going to make it. Actually, you're doing quite well. And now the question is, how much do you want to scale? And what are the leadership challenges that you're going to face along the way? This work is based on both my training as a coach and in my work as an operator in growing my old company ConvertKit from $3 to $30 million in annual revenue. If you're a founder or creator who might benefit from coaching, or if you know someone who's looking for a coach, I'd love for you to check out my site and my coaching page at barrettbrooks.com/coaching. You can learn everything about how I work as a coach and also fill out a form to have an exploratory conversation if that sounds interesting to you. All right, that's all I got for you right now. There's no sponsors for the show at the moment, so consider me your sponsor. Let's get back to the conversation for the second half. The last 2 I want to call out are bringing speakers in is an act of exposure. It's an active act of exposure. Let's get interested and curious about new ideas and admit our humility on what we don't know. And then bringing facilitators in, therapists, coaches, whatever it might be, I believe increases the surface area for vulnerability in an organization. It inherently feels unsafe for people to be vulnerable. So let's just start there. In any relation, in our safest, most important relationships, it feels more unsafe to be vulnerable a lot of times because we have more to lose. And at work, we have a lot to lose. If nothing else, it's our financial foundation. It's really hard for people to be vulnerable and transparent. And so by having a facilitator there, you say not just be transparent, be vulnerable, share with me, and vice versa, but you say, and we're going to pay someone to be here to facilitate the hardship of that, the challenge of that, and actively make sure that we don't damage the trust that we value it. That's the value. That's the value of couples therapy. That's the value of therapy. That's the value of facilitation, is whatever your natural triggered response might be to something that's hard to hear, you take a beat when there's someone else in the room instead of just responding. And like just that one little thing can transform the interaction.
Exactly. And I think having that third party who's seen patterns across difficult conversations to be like, hey, I'm going to just share some coaching tips of like how to respond to really difficult news. One of my like pet peeves is that we don't teach young kids at various moments how to be emotionally attuned and able to have difficult conversations and how to respond to difficult news in a way that is approachable and like being able to actually like process it and like talk through it and not just tune out or like get triggered because that's difficult news and like now we can't get past that thing. Obviously that's a huge thing that I think generally society is becoming more aware of, so I'm hopeful that we can make progress there, but I feel like it needs to become part of MBA classes, like part of like maybe undergrad, high school. I don't know, like there needs to be like consistent work there because it ultimately, I believe, will lead to better friendships, better marriages, better communities, right? If we can repair that conflict. My fiance and I are just going through premarital counseling and learning great just value commitment to repair. Like I commit to you to repair conflict and big or small, and what that looks like. That can be very challenging. We've had some very intense moments at New Story where that conflict has gone unresolved. And it's been very challenging because it doesn't go away. It's still there. And you may like think that, oh, we're past that. We've figured that out. But if you sweep something under the rug, it starts to smell. That doesn't go away. And that's true of personal relationships, work relationships, marriage, etc.
Culture is shaped by leaders. Obviously, culture is shaped by every participant in an organization, but especially by leaders. And, I think what you're talking about is a way of being and encouraging wholeness at work, acknowledging that conflict is going to happen. You're going to hurt people. People are going to hurt you at work. And a lot of the kind of classic model, maybe of our parents, I should say, and before that, it was like, you don't show emotion at work. You actively try not to show emotion at work because that could damage your career. And there's still a lot of workplaces where that's true. I'm interested in working with people who believe it can be something else. That's why we're having this conversation, right? That's why we're such good friends, because there is a different way that is a way of being whole and a way of encouraging people to become whole by understanding, first of all, their own emotions. Secondly, by being able to communicate with care about how other people's actions and emotions have affected them, and then being able to reconcile together. Like that is at the heart of human relationship. Long-term human relationship requires it. Yeah. You're never going to be in relationship with someone you don't have conflict with, period.
Or you may be in relationship, so to speak, right? Like shallow, surface level relationship. I've really tried to be intentional, and it's difficult to lean into that space of conflict and communicate that. I have a tendency to be a peacemaker, and so to not lean into that, space, or to be vague and not specific. And so I'm constantly trying to remember, okay, lean in, be specific, share that, this is just my perception. I'm curious to know how you felt in that moment or what your thoughts were. Because if we share feedback or conflict in a way where we are right and they are wrong, we're not going to be able to meet in the middle, or the other person is not going to hear us, right? No one likes to be told that you are wrong. And especially in a gray area with conflict, sometimes it can be challenging. My good buddy and I talk about there's a spectrum of like challenge to curiosity. And somewhere in between there is where we need to like land. And obviously each situation requires discernment, right? Sometimes I need to be curious because I have no idea what just happened. And then other times I do need to call someone up. I do want to ask them for something, and obviously in a kind way. But like that spectrum, and sometimes it's a mixture, right? But that spectrum, I think, has been helpful for me to understand. Am I being curious here? Am I being challenging? Some mixture of both?
You've already worked on this so much, but one encouragement or reframe I would offer to you on the peacemaker thing is thinking about conflict as one of several paths to peace, and a necessary one sometimes for true peace, not just the swept peace under the rug kind. Yeah.
I don't think I fully understood what peace, like true peace, is versus false peace. We cannot talk about something and be at peace just because like we're both like leaning back, but ultimately, like we said, that doesn't go away. That sticks with us. And it really makes me sad too to think about how, especially male friendships, over time, the data shows that males typically end up with fewer and fewer friends over time. And some of that's related to becoming uprooted, like we were just talking about. But I think a lot of that's due to like relational, I would say like emotional health.
Yeah, and the ability to get real and stay real with one another, where real is defined as here's what's really going on with me. Here's what my actual emotions. If I let down, the stoic front. Stoicism is a beautiful thing, but understood the wrong way, it can become toxic. Stoicism is an ability to understand our emotions and then choose our reaction to them. It's not to have emotions, from my perspective anyways. And I think that a lot of male relationships suffer from the lack of revealing of the inner game. I want to talk about you as a leader for a few minutes. I guess the core of what I want to get to is kind of, in what ways upon reflection did you need to grow in order to become the leader the organization needed today?
I think a large one is learning, and I'm still learning this, to use my voice, whether it's in those conflict situations or it's in those moments of strategy or other discussions, but to be vocal, strong, bold. I've learned I have somewhat of a tendency to hold something until it's like perfect, or like I like can like articulate it well. And sometimes the ship can get, sailing before I like process it. And some of that's related to organizational culture too, right? If you're just doing things like very rapidly and quickly, like, and not spending time thinking or deliberating or spending a longer period of time discussing, can be a challenge. So that is a big one. It's like learning to use my voice, communicate what I believe is true, what I believe needs to happen. That's been a big one. And that can be challenging again in a co-founder relationship where there's three, and there's dynamics around who's most vocal, who's most opinionated, and things like that, right? The other one I would say is learning to display leadership in a way that's not just by example. I think my kind of ethos is to lead by example. And I think that's very important and very useful for the team. You don't want to ask a team member to do something that you're not willing to also roll up your sleeves and do if needed. You want to be like side by side. But I also think, and again, still growing and learning here, is how to be that leader that is more out there and vocal and verbal. I think within an organization, we have our different silos and we can have influence there, but leaders also need to have influence across the organization too.
Where did you first notice that leading by example was no longer sufficient? Or maybe is there a time that really stands out to you when you acted on the knowledge that it needed to be more than that?
I'm not thinking of a good example that's coming to my mind. I think some of it's related to proactiveness. So some of those peacemaker tendencies can be like to like lean back and wait. Yeah, I wish I could think of a better example of something that's coming to my mind.
Yeah, that's okay. When you think about moving from leading by example, which in a lot of ways is the kind of like servant leader model, lead by example, serve the people around you, be in the trenches with them. What are the needs organizationally that aren't being met by that sufficiently well for what they need from you?
There can be a gap in perspective. So like each of our co-founders, we're all different, right? Brett brings something that I don't bring. I bring something that Brett doesn't bring. Allie brings something that neither Brett or I bring. And so like if I'm not, let's say, speaking as much in front of the team, like some of my just unique way of communicating might not be brought to the organization or brought to the perspective of the issue at hand. And so I think it's a combo of knowing when to, say, hey, let's do a joint statement about this thing, or hey, I'll take this, topic and run with it. Some of that has been just because we've like needed to like really focus in a given area. It's like, okay, let's just like divvy up the responsibilities. So I think some of it's from a like organizational level, just like being more present, and maybe it's just more heard. I don't know if that's
almost more visible. Yeah.
Yeah. Visible is probably the better word.
Yeah. The two ways that kind of hits me as I hear you talk about it is first of all, people may not see all the ways you're leading behind the scenes. They may not see the way the conversations between co-founders related to strategy are happening. They may not see, the on the ground leadership you're providing wherever you are showing up. The other aspect is they may not understand what you are trying to teach through your actions and leading by example. There may be a gap in understanding of what you're trying to communicate by the way that you are showing up and what people are interpreting from that. And sometimes I do think it's necessary to become vocal and more visible to fully communicate your vision, what it is that you're trying to drive towards as a leader. And I can personally relate to this one. Like I am a vocal leader for sure, but I would prefer to be leading by example. I would prefer for people just to naturally follow my lead, my natural or my action lead. And I have to really like flip a switch for myself in order to be vocal. And it's usually from a place of like, people are not getting what I'm trying to communicate. And that means I am not leading effectively. And something has to make up that gap,
Yeah. And I think the communication piece is critical with the dynamic world we live in, the noisy world we live in. I think will continue to be a superpower of leaders is effective communication and meeting people where they're at with that communication. I don't know if I have necessarily a like nugget to share there or wisdom to share there, but I think asking for feedback and receiving that feedback humbly is really important for a leader to say, okay, I just shared that message with the team. Let me follow up, tomorrow morning and ask a couple people like, what did you take away? Like what landed with you? What was confusing?
What's been the hardest piece of feedback that you've gotten on your leadership as you've been leading this organization?
I don't know if this is the most difficult. It's just the one that comes to mind immediately because we've kind of just done a cycle of feedback. It was more or less paraphrasing. Matthew needs to take follow through on what he hears. And that is really difficult to hear because there's a lot of things I don't take action on because I think that it may not be necessary, or it may be better for that to play out within those two people or for those two individuals to have a conversation versus me stepping in. But then I also need to reflect and be like, okay, but is that, true? Like, where is it that I'm not following through? And so one of the things that I want to do better and it's usually related to difficult conversations. Like someone shares something like, hey, I think this is a mistake, or I think this was done poorly. And then taking that and saying like, thank you for sharing that. Here's what I'm going to do. So I'm really trying to understand and ask team members, do you just want me to listen? Do you want me to respond with like brainstorming? Or do you want me to take this to somewhere else and like work on it and come back? So really asking like, what are their expectations? And they may not know, and that's okay, but at least asking, okay, you've just shared something hard. What do you expect from me here? Because I could make some assumptions. And sometimes they may say, oh, you don't need to do anything with it. And I need to take judgment and be like, no, that's actually really important for us to work on, maybe at the executive team level or within this department and whatnot, right? There's some judgment and discernment that needs to go into that.
One of the things that I've had to grow in and that I think is a really critical skill for leaders is there's kind of these two common modes of feedback receipt that happen. One is outright rejection. And I think that can often lead to cultures of a lack of feedback, lack of transparency, kind of like fear-driven around saying the truth. It comes from a very natural place of it being painful sometimes to receive feedback. And the other is outright acceptance of feedback. Well, they said it, so it must be true. And I fall into that camp. I have such a really severe inner critic that when someone else reflects criticism back at me, it's like, number one, it's hugely painful. And number two, it's like, oh, well, I must suck. Just inside, it must be horrible. And I take it as true. And I think mature, wise, seasoned leadership is about accepting all feedback in the moment and encouraging the full expression of it, like you're talking about, asking questions to clarify, but then sitting with it and discerning, what do I think about this? Is there feedback related to something I'm doing intentionally? And therefore, I think I should keep doing, but maybe with small adjustments. Is this something that I wasn't aware of that now I've had a new thing revealed to me that I need to be more aware of? Or is it just straight up like they're right? And I do think after sitting with it that I should correct for that, and there's lots of everything in between there. But the tendency, I think, to deal with the pain is to want to do one of those black or white things, reject it or accept it immediately. And I think the real skill is like empathizing and trying to understand and then going away and sitting with yourself, in a journal or a coach or a whatever.
Yeah, because the reality is it's probably somewhere in between. Like there's probably some nugget, like if someone were to give you feedback and say, Barrett, you just don't listen. It's like, that doesn't feel true, but like, is there something in there that like, could it be related to the way I'm communicating or like the moments when I'm communicating, et cetera? There's probably something there, but it's almost like digging for it in a way. And that's a skill in of itself, is coaching your team to give specific feedback. We just had a feedback process that there was some very like cruel feedback in there. Like it was very like unhelpful and just like didn't actually lead to any discovery there. And we took that moment to share with the teams like, hey, we received some feedback. This is on a full team call. It's like, hey, we received some feedback. It's just very rude or like unhelpful, cruel, mean-spirited. Like ultimately that's not going to serve, maybe you felt good writing it, but it's not going to serve us. It's not going to serve you because we don't know what you mean when you say so-and-so is, X, Y, Z. And so I think those moments can also be coaching moments to help the other side share in a way that is actually helpful.
Yeah. You have a goal, you have something you're trying to achieve, and the way you're doing it is not effective right now. Right. And so let's talk about ways to be effective. Yeah. Done a horrible job of pacing us. And so I want to spend about 10 minutes talking about the very personal side of showing up and leading and all the things we've talked about, being mission driven, building culture, leading require energy, and it requires a high level, done well, it requires a high level of continued performance from you, from Brett, from Allie, from anyone who's leading. And for high functioning organizations, really everyone has to have their own version of it. I was recently talking to a mutual friend of ours, and he was sharing an anecdote about one of the backers of his company talking about entrepreneurs and high growth companies being similar to professional athletes. And before everyone kind of scoffs and is like, what are you talking about? Let me explain a little further. Obviously, the physical element is nowhere close to the same. However, leadership and building companies is a highly mentally taxing activity. And the mental requirements, I think, are very similar to the level of performance required of athletes. And if you look at the way a top-notch athlete trains, rests, recovers, the way they eat, the way they sleep, the way they work out, the way they have a coach, a therapist, a support system, are all of those things accessible to everyone? No. but getting 8 hours of sleep a night is, eating well is accessible with exceptions, obviously, and exercise. Yes. Right. So some of the things that I'm curious about are like, what are those foundational habits for you that allow you to maintain performance? And, when you're at your best, how are you going about doing that?
Yeah. And this has been a learning journey, similar to yours in terms of like getting the seasons of unhealth and then realizing like, phew, this is not working. Like I just can't do this anymore. I do remember a vivid time, like coming out of Y Combinator and a couple months after that, just like, I'm so tired. Like I just couldn't do it. And I think, and I'm thinking more about this, as I head into marriage and, hopefully eventually kids, is that I do think there's a true limit to our number of hours per week that where we can be our best, and all this like hacking of time, hacking of strategy, hacking of tactics maybe works incrementally, but there are like true fundamental limits, I think, on like, and we're talking about sustained time, right? Not sprints. Like, of course you could do a sprint, like Y Combinator was 3 months and we only time we went and worked on was Sunday. So like there are times when it's possible and, it's still unhealthy, but yeah, I'm thinking, more and more, and I think the trend will lead to this, like people working less hours. I think 4-hour work weeks will become more standard in a couple of years. Maybe it'll take longer, but I think generally people will feel better and be more efficient when they just accept the fact that like we have limited time in the day to do it. So anyways, that's a more meta thought. On the like practical side, one big thing for me is like getting consistent blood work to make sure that I am not deficient in any major areas, because I was deficient in vitamin D. I was deficient in folic acid. I think maybe vitamin K or E, one of them. So I had a couple areas, and like those truly fundamentally, I believe, affect our mental health and obviously directly physical health. But I think there's a lot. Vitamin D has been tracked to a lot of being able to learn and retain information. And living in San Francisco, you don't get much, in Portland as well.
Same in Portland, yeah.
Very, very important. So anyways, like
fundamentals. I just want to validate that real quick. I mean, it's like an underrated thing. And Tim Ferriss has done a good job talking about this stuff over the years. A lot of people in the kind of like paleo type movement have talked a lot about the value of blood work. And listen, this is not medical advice. We're not doctors. We're just two guys who run companies and organizations and have tried to do our best to take care of our own health. But I do the same thing. Every 6 months, I get much broader blood work done than what would be typical at a normal primary care physician. We both see functional health providers. I also see physicians, but my baseline is to see a naturopath that's trained in both naturopathy, but also functional medicine, and does both. And it's amazing what you can learn about yourself, how your stress affects your blood work, deficiencies you might have. There might just be chemistry things going on in your body that need to be balanced. So anyways, I just want to, couldn't recommend it enough.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like it's the early days of this trend. I think this will start to become more common, or new medicine will become traditional medicine, which I hope. So anyways, that really important. I know when I'm at my best, I'm exercising in the morning. I wake up and have quiet time, which includes prayer and reading, time to not rush through the morning. That's when I'm at my best. And I've actually been in a short season here of not getting that. And I feel it. I very much feel it. It is directly tied to, am I winning the night? Because the morning is set by your night. Like if you're not getting to bed by whatever, 10 p.m., 10:30, let's call it, you're not going to win the morning. And it's just very clear. It's very obvious. There's no matter what kind of like magnesium pill you take, if you're not getting 8 hours, something like that, 7 hours, whatever, it's going to be directly tied. So that's a big one for me. The other one is having good social time and good social connection. I think in the early days, and I think San Francisco has a little bit of a flaw here, is people spend so much time working on their startup that they don't spend as much time being social. Or if they're social, they're talking about their startup, which I think is like a little bit of a
antithetical to the point of social time in some cases, or the true value of it maybe.
So I think social time is really critical. And then this is something that I also struggled with in San Francisco, and then here in Atlanta, I'm hopeful to have more time, just more time in like a garden or in nature. I think it's really important to work with our hands, and like get our hands dirty and get into the sun. Like it's just like fundamental. It's just so important.
Yeah. I wish we could go so much deeper on all of those, but I'm going to forego that in the name of spending a few minutes talking about roots and the role that having roots and returning to your roots and being back in Atlanta plays in you being able to maintain your own work and your own performance long term.
Yeah. So I think a lot about this, and I think some of it is directly tied to some of the things we're feeling in our world these days. I think there's like a general trend of the industrialized world heading towards like a monoculture. I don't think it's helpful. I think it's harmful. And it's proliferated by like technology and a lot of other like centralization trends. But I think it's really important to have a very tight local community. Like if we think back to the times where we have the best friendships, the like deepest connections, a lot of people point back to college. They're like, at college, I lived across the hall from someone, or I lived across the street from someone. I could walk to their house. And obviously college is a unique environment, but why does it have to be unique? Why can't we live in places that are more walkable, that have more of that community aspect to it? And there's many reasons, and won't get into all of those, but I am spending a lot of time thinking about that here in Atlanta. Like, what does it look like to establish roots for the long term and really sacrifice for community, not optimize for the most financial upside in a house and then jump to the next neighborhood that's going to have the next financial upside for a house, but sacrificing time, energy, and resources for that community, I think it's important for our individual selves. But then if we're talking about any type of long-term change, I think it doesn't happen without local connection, local roots. I don't think a large government program, whether it's at the state or the federal level, is going to be sustainable without local communities.
Yeah. One of my favorite writers, his name's Wendell Berry, and I mean, just any number, poetry, nonfiction. He lives on a farm in Kentucky and writes widely, but he firmly believes that being detached from place is bad for our health and our society. And as I've gotten older, I've felt that too. We have that in common. We talk a lot about that together when we're in community. And so much of the creator economy that I come from was built on freedom from place, freedom from work, freedom from obligation. And there's great power in that. I think that on the other side of that, freedom to explore and get exposed to things and have new ideas and meet new people is beautiful. And on the other side of it, I think where you end up coming back to is a desire for freedom within constraints. And for me, at least, like you, the constraints that I thrive in are rooted in community, rooted in physical place, rooted in specific people and streets and neighborhood, all of those things. We moved into a house at the beginning of the pandemic, and I know our neighbors for a block in 3 different directions. It transformed how I felt about where we live. Are they my best friends? No, but it changes how I feel about this place. And I believe that living in community, I think we believe that living in community makes you much more likely to be able to achieve the things you're setting out to achieve. And in our case, what we're setting out to achieve is impact. And I think it's underrated as something we should value. I think many entrepreneurs think if I just work and I eat sufficient to get calorie intake, I'm good. Something along those lines. Like that's the classic kind of playbook. It's like work yourself until you get successful. I don't know. I think that misses something.
All we have to do is look at the longest lived people in the world and to see that that's not true, right?
Yeah.
The people who live in Okinawa, Japan, and Sardinia, Greece, etc., they all have a sense of purpose, community, some type of spiritual network, places that naturally move them, and a couple other things I'm probably missing on.
Yeah.
But like there's not like, it's not like some secret. There's not like a book you need to go read. It's like very obvious. And I think the more we talk to the older generations, like that we still have access to, they can, tell us like, I remember going to a weekend trip with a bunch of guys, and we had 3 or 4 dads, and they all said, I wish I worked less, and I wish I spent more time with my family and community.
Which is
every single one of them.
People say at the end of their lives as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we've reached the end of our time together. I got to hop to another meeting, but what I want to round this out with is what I think is beautiful about where we ended up is that you are also creating that for others. You are creating a sense of place and a connection to a permanent, safe, wholesome community for individuals in the world. And it's all sparked by this emotional experience you had when you were younger. I have immense love and admiration for you and the team at New Story and all of the work that you've done. Thanks, Matthew.
Thanks, Barrett. I love you too, and appreciate the time and space.
Talk to you soon. Thanks for listening to this episode of Good Work. I'm your host and the creator of the show, Barrett Brooks. The show is produced by my friends over at Podcast Royale. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe or follow wherever you get your podcasts, whether it's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts, or YouTube, or wherever else. I really love having you follow along for every episode of the show. My guest today was Matthew Marshall. Matthew is the founder of the not-for-profit New Story, which you can find at newstoryhomes.org. Be sure to check out their work as a not-for-profit, and I'm sure Matthew would be greatly honored, as would I, if you might even consider making a donation to help support their work. As always, you can see all of the clips, quotes, takeaways, and links from this episode at goodworkshow.com. You can also find all of the past episodes and all of their show notes at goodworkshow.com as well. So please make sure to check it out there. If you enjoyed today's episode, there's 2 things I'd love you to do. Number 1 is copy the link to the episode and text it or email it to just one friend who you think would enjoy the show. Podcasts spread through one-to-one word of mouth. I know that. It's a long journey to build an audience, and I'd love your help with that. The second thing you can do is if you're feeling really generous, you can leave a review on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or just a comment on YouTube. All those things help with the engagement metrics that fuel the algorithms to help other people find the show. So that would be incredibly generous of you, and I'm grateful for it. Next week on the show, you're going to hear from a really special guest. His name is Matt Mullenweg. He is one of the founders of WordPress. He is the founder of Automatic, and he is doing some incredible work in the world. He's been at it for over 20 years now, or right at 20 years now that he's been at Automatic. I caught him right in the middle of his 3-month sabbatical, which is the first one he's ever taken from his role at Automatic. And it was really fun to hear what he's learning through that process, how he came to be the kind of founder and leader that he is, and so much more about the world of Automatic and WordPress, which powers about half of the internet at this point. So I hope you'll look forward to that episode, and I'll look forward to seeing you there.